How's it going, everybody? And today I wanted to make a really quick video just for the fun of it, and I wanted to talk about what is considered the most violent event in human history. And throughout history, people, at least on YouTube, had this fascination about, the worst things or the most controversial things or whatever the case, right? But when we talk about wars on YouTube channel, like the YouTube channel the Kings and Generals, great channel, or the Cold War, or the Great War, or all of those similar YouTube channels, right? And in the end of the video, I will explain on the list what do they have in common. In the video, I will say what is objectively, or at least I would try what is considered the most objective as you could possibly try to get as the most violent event in human history. What do we mean by violent? Well, this is a very controversial topic. How do you define violence? Today, many people consider this is the most peaceful period in human history, that is the least violent. And usually, we judge violence in this type of conversation is barbarism. The overall, of the global population, how many people die a violent death from wars, criminality, abuse, and stuff of that nature. Usually, they do not talk about economic violence. They usually move away from that because it goes against their narrative of capitalism, right? In this case, sadly, I had to ignore the economic violence as well, at least to an extent. And we gotta talk about, objectively speaking, the 10 most violent periods in human history in chronological order. And in fact, I originally wanted to do a top 20, but I think a top 10 would be more fitting because round numbers, right? So before we gotta have some honorable mentions. At the number 11, just right under the top 10 was Maoist China. If Maoist China is number 11, not even the top 10, imagine how bad things would get proportion to the world population at the time. Also, part of the honorable mention, Stalinist Russia, World War One, the 30 Years' War. So, yeah, things will get a little feisty. So, let's start with number 10. Number 10 is the Taiping Rebellion, the deadliest war in the 19th century. It is a war originally started by this guy, Huan Yushan, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who failed tests and became a religious fanatic in Christianity, who had a vision that revealed to him that he was the brother of Jesus Christ, and started a religious war. That, depending the sources, somewhere between 2 to 3% of the world's population perished throughout this religious war in China, a Christian war, to dominate and make their own kingdom in the southern part of China called the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, which was a monarchy and a theocracy. So yeah, that's number 10. Number 9 is World War II. You hear me right. World War II is number 9. Again, same thing with the previous one. 3% of the world's population perished. Why? Because it was a mix of religious and racism, where you have fascism who believe in racial superiority of the Anglo-Saxons, which has its origins in Christian anti-Semitism with the influence of Martin Luther and his hatred of the Jews, and that anti-Semitic Protestant theology was persistent in Germany up until World War II with the rise of Hitler and his power. And America, before they joined the war, they view Hitler in a positive life, and in fact, many polls have showed that people view the Jews as a bigger threat than the Nazis during the beginning of World War II, and they didn't want to go on Hitler's side until Pearl Harbor happened, and Winston Churchill, who even though he was fighting against the fascists, he was friends with Mussolini and viewed him as a great man. And Oh man, there's a lot of stuff that people don't talk about, right? Americans deporting thousands of Jews who escaped from Nazi Germany because they thought they were Soviet spies. So it was thanks to the Soviets who defeated the Nazis, the anarchist resistance movements in France, Italy, and Poland, and the Jewish resistance movement, which I made a video before, fighting against the Nazi. It wasn't much of the American; they took all the credit. Yeah, that. And also Japan with his absolute theocratic monarchy, would the emperor was the next Buddha or the Maitreya. That was the thing. Zen Buddhism promoted Japanese fascism. There's that, even though Zen Buddhism has a reputation for being the most atheistic and anarchistic branch of Buddhism. um, if you know what they did in World War II, it is the complete opposite what they're actually teaching. If you bother to remove all the romanticization, the Orientalism of Japanese society. Number 8, we have the Atlantic slave trade. This mixed with the next part of the list, 10% of the world's population perish. And this is where if the capitalism and Christianity became the dominant religion and economic power in the world, where basically half of the known world at the time, because Oceania was still yet undiscovered by Europeans at this moment, were basically against their will convert to Christianity or die or go to hell if you believe it. In many cases they enslaved many Africans, mostly from the western African parts of Africa, like the Yoruba people specifically. And the justification, like in many cases, was religion. And economically speaking, this is where capitalists actually got their grasp and power, because before this, mercantilism and feudalism was still the dominant approach until the Atlantic slave trade moved away from that to straight up capitalism. Although capitalism's been around as far back as the 9th century. I will explain that later in this list. And number 7 is the annihilation of the indigenous people of the Americas. By far the biggest genocide in human history. Like I said, if you mix the Atlantic slave trade with this one, right, and it was the most dangerous event that happened not only in that period but of all time. And like I said, this is number 7, so it gets even further how it goes. So, and the annihilation of the America with the discovery of the Americas, again, the justification of religion is seeing these people as pagan heathens or devil worshippers for believing a God that isn't Jesus, and also destroying their economic and the philosophies they have, especially in Inca Empire where they have Inca socialism, or if you have various tribes in in the United States of America, there were multiple tribes like the Cherokee and the Navajo and the Iroquois Confederacy, who were living in an anarchist society and independently developed their own form of democracy as a consensus democracy. 400 years they have this type of anarchist society. You also have the Blackfoot Confederacy in Canada, which they have their own anarchist society, and other indigenous people they have their own anarchist society from Latin America as well. And fun fact, each part of the Americas, the only indigenous tribes who were never conquered were anarchist societies. Like for example, in the United States, the only Native American tribe that was never conquered were the Seminoles in Florida, who have an anarchist society. And the same thing with Latin America, the Mapuche people who had an anarchist society were the only indigenous people in Latin America who were conquered. Or in the Caribbean, the Cuban Taínos or the Cubaway, they were also living in an anarchist society. They were the only ones that were never properly conquered as well. So it shows you the consistency compared with the hierarchical societies of the rest of the Americas. And in fact, the only successful indigenous revolt in the history of America was the Pueblo people, before the American European discovery, living in an anarchist society, and they started what is considered anarchist revolution, who didn't want any hierarchical power. But the leader of the Pueblo revolt, after successfully kicking out the Europeans, he started to adopt the European style of government and started to develop a hierarchical approach, which heavily corrupted and were easily conquered by the Europeans, because if you kill the leader, everything grows apart in a hierarchical society, while in a non-hierarchical society, it's like trying to stab water to death. That's not gonna work. Number 6, we have Timur the Ling, who, again, conquer basically big portion of the war, spreading Islam with the sword, killing around 5% of the world's population at the time. Again, he is well known for his brutality, and I recommend a YouTube channel called Al Muhagiti. I hope I didn't pronounce that. If I did, I didn't meant to offend you in event, like saying this in event. That wasn't my intention. He has a great YouTube channel that focuses about Islamic history. He has a video dedicated to this particular figure, about his contribution to the culture and everything, right? But this video talk about the most violent moments in human history, so this is more of a negative perspective. Number 5 is the fall of Rome. Yes, the fall of Rome is number 5 of the most violent event in human history. And the reason Roman Empire fell was a combination of factors. It wasn't one single factor. It's actually very complicated. But to make it as straightforward as possible to get to the point, it was a mix of political corruption, civil war, infighting for aggression of the quote-unquote barbarians, even though many barbarians were integrated into Roman society and became a major part of the military, as the economic instability, and Christianity was on the rise, which at the beginning, up until the 4th century, where they changed the mentality, they were anti-science, anti-education, anti-philosophy. They were basically anti-intellectualism. It was until the 4th century where they're trying to move away from this. I already made an entire video about the anti-intellectual origins of Christianity, and also the origins of anti-Semitism, which again has its origin in Christianity as well, and to a lesser extent the Jewish religion as well, ironically enough, but that's like depending how you view things, not like accurate. So like I said, it's a very complicated, and the fall of Rome was one of the most devastating events in human history. That it took us 1,000 years to recover the same technological scientific advancement they did, where they were at their peak at the 2nd century, and it took us 500 years to surpass them. So there's that. And number 4, we had the fall of the Ming Dynasty. Just like the Roman Empire, the fall of the Ming was one of the most devastating events in human history as well. Like I said, it's number 4. And many the Ming, the Qing Dynasty and other similar societies sections, there was extreme violence and civil wars, and also other factors like economic policies, or corruption and diseases and famine that exacerbated the violence over time. Unlike others in the list where the main justification were religious based, this one was purely political and pretty much secular, unlike other parts of the list. Number 3 is the Middle East slave trade, also known as the Arabic slave trade, also known as the Islamic slave trade. And this is by far one of the most horrific events in human history. Not only because this predates the Atlantis slave trade. In fact, the Atlantis slave trade was based and response to the Atlantis slave trade to make their own economic dominance, right? And again, the justification was religious in nature, of the slavery of people, and many early Islamic scholars during the golden age of Islam view people of color, especially like Ethiopian, as inferior. So this is like early proto-racism. Again, there's a great video from Bayan Banada where the origins of racism as we know today, of discriminating people based on the color of their skin, has its origins in Islamic thinking, although it was a very fringe group, not a majority group, but that fringe group heavily was adopted by the Europeans and the Christians at the time. And this is, like I said earlier, like the origins of capitalism has its origins here. People will argue that technically speaking, capitalism, or at least capitalist way of thinking, like intellectually speaking, can go a little farther back without, well, there's not much of an evidence, which like with some exceptions like Menciu from China, who had an early proto free market capitalist way of thinking but never put into practice, or the Jains in Jainism, who were a mercantile class, so they were like a proto capitalist and benefited from the imperial expansion and imperialism and colonialism in Southern Asia. So yeah, despite having a reputation for peace loving, they were they were okay with economic violence, imperialism, colonialism in order to maintain their mercantile class. But capitalism, as we know it today, of the private ownership of the means of production, can go as far back as the Islamic slave trade, and in fact, the earliest reference of the labor theory of value or the means of productions and even like terms like that can go as far back as these Islamic slave trade as far back as the 15th century. And again, in Europe, they were adopting these similar approaches in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries with the origins of banks and other similar ethnic concepts. It wasn't until like the 15th century where capitalism really trying to get a good grasp during Europe, but it was a very niche in specific towns like in Italy, in Venice. It wasn't until like the Atlantic slave trade, and especially in the first industrial revolution, where capitalism truly became the dominant force. In number two, the most violent event in human history is the Mongol invasions. It started by Genghis Khan, although it lasted for decades and centuries I've had, and it was the second largest empire in human history. Number one is the British Empire, who hold basically a third of the world's land at the time. The but like I said, everybody knows about the Mongol. They have basically a meme at this point. And Genghis Khan had a big foothold of the carbon environment of the world that, thanks to his imperial expansion and brutality, 11% of the world's population perished under his conquest. And again, in some cases, you could argue his conquest was religious in nature, because we have very many sources that before he go to battle, the day before, he go to his tent and pray to his god, the Mongolian shamanistic religion of the great sky god, right before he goes to battle. So there is some religious significance or religious justification, but what to one extent is pretty unknown. So far we cannot say for sure. But like I said, if this is number two, what the fuck is number one? So let me show you. Number one, the most, objectively speaking, proportion to the population at the time, the most violent event in human history. 1/4 of the world population died. A third of China's population perished. It is so brutal. It is called the Anlusha Rebellion. It all started by this asshole who wanted to be a king. That's it. He just wanted power. And again, a quarter of the world population, right, that they perished because he just wanted power. That's how brutal he was. And many of the deaths were cannibalism, because people were starving. So, like I said in the end of the video, what do these societies have in common? All of them, with the exception of the Anlusha and Timur Leng, the Roman Empire, the fall of Ming, right? And with those exceptions, right, all of them were capitalist societies. Many of them, these events were motivated by religion. And all of them were hierarchical societies where they wanted power. It shows you that hierarchical power is cruel, and it goes against our evolution, how we evolved as a species based of communal, if the way of living based of mutual aid and cooperation. Like the San people, the Hatsal, the Mipuni, the Yamasing, the Cuban Taino, the Mapuche, the Seminole, the Aboriginal Australia, the Maori of the Chapman Islands, the youngest indigenous culture in the world that only been around for 400 years, 300 years. And so it's like it shows you that we had to go back a revolution where we should behave how we actually behave, because it shows you that non-hierarchical societies are less violent than hierarchical society. I already made a video about the origins of crime, why we should abolish the police and prisons, right? And like I said, we already met the material preconditions than our hunter-gatherer, immediate return society ancestors live. In fact, I already made a video about At the 90s century, we met the material precondition. We could be a sci-fi civilization, but the rise of anti-intellectualism, anti-nuclear movement, the rise of of right-wing philosophy, the rise of conservatism, neoliberalism, all other factors prevent that happen. Of these truly liberatory societies and the rise of pessimism at the end of the 60s. I already mentioned this in the previous video. Like I said, we had to go back and like I said, postmodernism is dead, and now we're in a postmodern society. So we should learn our lessons. What should we do as a society? So yeah, thank you everybody who watched this video. Like, subscribe, share. Hope see you guys next time.